I look out my window and the sun is shining and it looks beautiful. And the weather forecast is really very dire. We're under a tornado watch. Um, there can be very strong winds and hail and who knows what else. So we've decided, in fact, with Ilan Troen's agreement, to allow so many people to access this lecture over Zoom. A couple hundred people have signed up for it, and for good reason. It's a very timely subject presented by an outstanding scholar. Tonight's lecture is one of two that Professor Troen will be offering. Tomorrow evening at the same time, 5:30, in the very same room, the Global and International Studies Building, room 1112, he will be speaking again. Tomorrow's talk will deal with October the 7th and its aftermath and all of the ramifications of that event and everything that's followed. Today's talk is going to deal with the religious dimensions of the dispute that so many of us pay a great deal of attention to. I can hardly think of a better person, in fact, to teach us about this subject. I have in front of me a copy of his most recent book, Israel-Palestine and World Religions, Whose Promised Land? And it's an absolutely fundamental, essential study of how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have connected to the Holy Land over many, many centuries. The dispute underway is, in many respects, a political one, a territorial one, but it's also a religious one. And the more we can learn about that aspect of it, the better. Professor Troen is extremely well equipped to teach us. He spent many years at Brandeis University, also at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, Israel. He starts out life in Boston, but emigrated to Israel in 1975 and has lived there ever since, with many, many trips abroad, including to Bloomington, I'm proud to say, where he taught for a month some years ago, created the journal, the important journal, the essential journal, Israel Studies, published by Indiana University Press, and much else. So let me welcome him. I apologize for not being there myself at the moment, but Rachel Kelly, who's just an absolutely splendid assistant, will look after things, including the chat during questions and answers. Ilan, it's now my pleasure to hand it over to you, and we look forward to learning from you.
Thank you. You're very kind as always. Always good to come back home to Indiana. That's a phrase that I've just invented. I also got married in Indiana, used to have family here. And in fact, wrote my dissertation and got pale in the basement of my in-laws' home in Dune Acres on the northwest corner. Everybody went out to get the sun. There is sun in Indiana, and I got pale writing a dissertation. But my memories are very happy, and this is a great university, and I'm glad to be associated with it. Let me begin by congratulating our director, Alvin Rosenfeld, for not only creating probably the leading center of Israel studies or Jewish studies in America, way out in Indiana, but for managing the politics of having a session on Israel on the campus. The last time I was in a campus was in Texas, and there were Texas Rangers to guard me and to spirit me out the back door to the airport, where I went on to my next stop. Alvin organized a weather report that said there would be a tornado. So we all knew there would be no demonstrations. And as those of us who look out the window here, It's bucolic, magnificent, very restful. It's a wonderful Indiana geography. So thank you, Alvin, for doing all of that for me. Let me get into what this talk is about. It's the Holy. My friends who do social sciences and political sciences may use the language of their disciplines in describing the conflict. But for most of human history, the conflict over the land between the river and the sea has been marked by religious conflict. And it changed markedly. It changed in 1917 when a Christian head of the cabinet, prime minister, issued a proclamation that this land that had been under the control of Muslims for 13 centuries, by and large, aside from 2 centuries of occasional Christian control during the Crusades, that this land would become Jewish. Wow. I mean, that's an extraordinary event and an extraordinary statement. And in fact, I would date the contemporary conflict from the Balfour Declaration and from the attempt to reverse that which had been settled history for 1,300 years, or if you're a Christian, 1,600 years since the time of Constantine and St. Augustine. So something revolutionary happened in the last century. And what happened in the last century, I think I know what to do here, is changing the ground rules of to whom the land belonged. Now, what this is a mid-19th century popular statement excerpt from a frontispiece of a very popular book written by Mark Twain. Mark Twain visited Palestine in 1869. It's Palestine. In 1869, he did what good writers did, like Trollope, and it's a long list. They traveled and got paid for their travels and got paid by the word. And so therefore, it's a large text. And he writes about what he sees in Palestine. And this becomes the key to what I wish to say. Mark Twain did not intend it, but I'm still going to use it. You can all read it. What he's really saying is, as I look across the Valley Bay, what I see is this. I see 2 guys carrying a big stick, clusters of grapes that look like grapefruit, right? And he calls them Sunday school grapes. Well, that's the humor of Mark Twain. What is he referring to? He tells us is that his knowledge of the Holy Land comes from Sunday school in Hannibal, Missouri. Well, my point to you is that all of us, whether or not we went to Sunday school in Hannibal, Missouri, went to an equivalent. All of us look at some level through a filter, a cultural filter, at that particular land between the river and the sea, another phrase that I'm inventing, in order to, and what they see is something that's filtered through that which they know. And people don't study Israel, they study religion. They study church history, they study their own traditions, their own faith traditions, and that's what they know about this place. So he saw Sunday school grapes. And then when I taught at Brandeis, the great thing about teaching graduate students at Brandeis was that more than half were not Jewish. And my Mormon student wrote about a man by the name of Hyde, 19th century figure, and carried the dissertation to the controversy over whether or not to establish a Mormon university in Jerusalem. So she looked at Jerusalem and the Holy Land through Mormon eyes. My student, who was a Protestant, father's a minister, wrote about 1967 and the change among evangelicals and the more active politics that derive therefrom. I could go through about 8 different religions, 8 different dissertations, all of which were informed by questions that were germane to the cultural experiences, knowledge of these students who interrogated Palestine, Israel of today through the filter of that which they really wanted to know. One of them in particular was crucial for me. He was from Indiana. His father's a minister. In his case, that didn't play out very much in the religious orientation of his work. Rather, he was a backpacker. And he used to go along the Appalachian Trail. And when he discovered Israel, he started going across the Israel Trail. Now, Shea Rabineau, it isn't Shai Rabinowitz, it's Shea Rabineau, probably a former Quebecois. He told me at one point that Catholics, who when they came to Jerusalem, did not want to see Gethsemane. Protestants, on the other hand, were uninterested in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was another way of reaffirming what my students were telling me, is that we have prisms through which we wish to interrogate, understand, examine this particular piece of territory. He wrote a prize-winning book called Walking the Land. It turns out Israel, next to maybe Switzerland, has more trails than any other country in the world per area. There's the Abraham Trail, there's the Israel Trail, there are trails for Muslims, trail for protesters, trails for settlers, trails for this one, trails for that one. You can walk this land. Ever since Abraham walked into the country, people have been walking that country and making, as you know, for the centuries. Many of us have been walking in the footsteps of someone. So there is no, by the way, one other thing, I'm losing my voice. One other thing, that if we took these same people, brought them to Mars, brought them back and asked them what they had seen, I'd be willing to bet they would describe much the same. But the descriptions of the Holy Land are much different. All right. So where do we begin? Let's begin with the primary issue that Zionists, Jews had dealing with what the British had done. And that is seek legitimacy for something that had no legitimacy for 13 or for 16 centuries. And the search for legitimacy is really much of the political and international history of Zionism over the last century. What we are going through now, at least those of us who are Zionists, or those of us who live there, is the unraveling of that legitimacy and its questioning. It may be worthwhile taking a look at the steps through which Israel or Jews achieve legitimacy. First of all, the Balfour Declaration. Secondly, the League of Nations, that's the UN of the period, reaffirm. And what are they reaffirming? They're reaffirming the issue, which is the heart of the controversy that's going on today. They're reaffirming the statement that Palestine should be constituted as the national home of the Jewish people. What's most important are the 2 letters that begin the word reconstitute. They mean, again, that Jews may return, restore, rebuild. It really affirms the fact that Jews have a connection with that land. 100 years ago, that was understood far more firmly than it is today. That's at the heart of the issue where the contest, the political and contest and the demonstrations and the literature and everywhere else is over. So the Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations, and even the British Peel Commission. It partitioned Palestine, but it did so on the basis that Jews had a real connection, and they deserve at least a piece of this land. 1947, the United Nations division to partition Palestine does much the same thing. We're going to take a look at the Israel Declaration of Independence in a moment. And Israel is accepted as a member of the United Nations in 1949 as a Jewish state, or as the state of the Jews who have come to reconstitute themselves and have a legitimate place in that part of the world. That's what was. It was always contested, but not on the same basis. It was contested at the battlefield. It was contested in international fora, but it wasn't contested in the kinds of terms that we hear today, such as Israel is colonial settler. Well, what does colonial settler mean? Colonial settler means they don't really belong. They come from some other place. As I'm going to try to point out to you, colonial settler is actually a secular form of supersessionism. Until 1917, the way in which the argumentation took place was, my God, my theology affirms that this territory belongs to me. But if you no longer argue about Palestine in the mosque, the synagogue, or the church, but the argument takes place in journals, in international fora, on the streets, what language do you use? You save religious language for religious settings. You need to find a secular equivalent, or a secular language that reflects your religious ideals. And what this book is about is the way in which theological concepts become masked in secular terminology. And that apparently the argument may be secular, but underneath it, there is this substrata of religious discourse, which is now many millennia old. Okay? So that's what all of this is about. And Israel's Declaration of Independence is a fascinating example of what Zionists used to do, which is to say, no place in the Israeli Declaration of Independence is there a statement to which many Jews, if not most, would agree that somehow there's a religious connection to the land. Nowhere does it say God gave it to us. Rather, a whole variety of secular arguments are marshaled, and these secular arguments are part of the debate which other peoples have as they argue or claim territories for themselves. So there is, in effect, a historic argument, right? That this is where we come from, that we are a people. 1917, First World War, Woodrow Wilson, League of Nations. This is the time of national wars, of popular liberation, of the liberation of peoples. Peoples have rights in the 20th century, and one of the rights that peoples have is the right to a state, that they are indigenous. Israel's declaration says the original culture is not only historic, but it's still manifest in language and literature and so on. They fought on the winning side. Now, this may surprise you, but conquest in international law was a valid justification until the United Nations was established. However, the formulations that no longer validate conquest have never been translated into Russian or into Chinese, and maybe into Arabic, and maybe some other languages. But in the English and the French, that you achieve land by conquest. And better if you fight on the winning side, of course. Purchase land. Who purchased Indiana? Jefferson? The Gadsden Purchase. Alaska. And Abraham purchased the land, the caves, the Hebron, but the JNF in my house, there was a little blue box, and that little blue box with zlotys and cents and marks and pfennigs purchased land. May the desert bloom. You just couldn't get land in Indiana in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, or the Morrill Act, land grant universities. You had to actually cultivate it. And if you didn't cultivate it in a couple of years, you couldn't own it. So by making the desert bloom, you had rights to land. And that goes to something John Locke imagined, and that is that all kinds of people have rights to land. Real natives do, nut gatherers do. But a shepherd has more rights because he invests labor. But the farmer, by the sweat of his brow, invests even more. So his rights are greater. So if you actually can make the desert bloom, it's a kind of claim. They never left. They never intended on leaving. They were expelled. They had a connection, necessity. There was a Shoah, and the Jews need land. And we live in a world where we grant rights to all kinds of people who need to have sanctuary. So sanctuary is part of it. International recognition, I just gave you the list from 1917. And the final justification in Israel's self-declaration of independence is copied from the American Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be manifest. It's the self-evident right. If you can't argue anything else, you say it's self-evident. The self-evident right of the Jewish people to be a nation, and all other nations are a state. What isn't there is that God gave it to us. The covenant is not mentioned. However, and we'll come to this at the very end, and we will someday come to the end of this lecture, is the most recent translation of the Declaration is made by the Jewish Telegraphic Association. And they translate Tzur Yisrael, Tzur, the rock of Israel, as Almighty God. So we'll come to that kind of transformation a little bit later. All right, what happened? Well, in 1975, the United Nations General Assembly resolution said Zionism is a form of racism. Racist states are not legitimate. They're thinking of South Africa. It's repealed, but it comes back. We're living in a half a century of an international growing consensus that Israel is not legitimate because of the way in which it is constituted. And the Durban Conference, which was the beginning of BDS, lawfare is the generic term for using international institutions to knock at Israel and to diminish its whatever legitimacy it might have. You who live in the academy know a good deal about this. This is one of the venues of contest, and we read about it, and depending upon the class and the textbook that you're reading, Zionism is colonial settler, and Jews are not indigenous, obviously. The Palestinians are, and we'll come and take a look at both of those a little bit later. And finally, that Israel is a criminal country engaging in war crimes. All of these are contested in the international sphere. It's a kind of conversation, not Balfour. Nobody, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, and others could not have imagined 70-something years ago. Totally new discourse. Whoops, we're going to come to that tomorrow. Whoops, there we go. Central thing. Claims that Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land are made in secular and theological terms. Do not think that because the locus of the dispute is no longer a religious setting, is that religious settings no longer discuss the conflict. You can go to some churches and discuss BDS, and the conversation over BDS will invoke both a theological as well as a secular conversation. Again, the point is that theology was dormant until World War I. You didn't have to talk about it because everybody knew what the other person's position was. But theology begins to become important when there's a dispute. And the dispute begins when a Christian argues that this land can be governed by a Jew. The Balfour Declaration, Christian imperial powers assert Jewish priority. That was, I thank Balfour for doing it, for his cabinet for agreeing, but that opened up the can of worms. All right, different discourses can and should be disentangled. And I think that's an interesting task, and you might want to attune your own ears to what are you really hearing? Are you hearing theological discourse? Or is this a social science argument? And where do the two meet and where are they joined? Okay, examples. Hamas, I finished the book before October 7th. I pulled the book from the publisher. I needed to write a somewhat different introduction and a different ending because what was so troubling, and it was immediate, was how people who I know and whose ideas I valued, who held to universal principles of justice and human rights, were able to justify and support the murderous, barbarous attacks of religious fanatics. How does that work? How do you bridge that? What is going on here? And I don't think that I have fully unraveled that, but there are connections that have to be plumbed. Secular supersessionism and theopolitics, we're going to come to this soon. There are some Palestinian liberation theologians who in fact invented the word theopolitics. That is to say, politics should be theological. And they are very much on the side of anti-Zionism. When you say land, Jewish land or Arab land, are you making a secular or a religious comment? What is it? Or is it both? And that's enough of that. Instances of tangles. Let me give you one instance, and it's a fascinating one. The single most argued issue during the period of the British Mandate was how many people could live in Palestine. The list of distinguished social scientists, historians, linguists, archaeologists, biblical scholars, you name it, who attempted to deal with this issue it's a who's who of the academy of the 1920s through the early 1940s. And there are two views. And the views were important because the mandate was issued and justified so long as the rights of the people who were living in the land were not compromised by an enhanced Jewish presence. And that meant you could have too many Jews there. Nobody wanted, well, some people did, but there should not be too many Jews in Palestine. Well, what are the real numbers here? And what's fascinating is that as you look at this debate, and you can look at this debate retrospectively, is that the people who sided with allowing for Jewish immigration were Zionists. The people who opposed it were Arabists, Arab supporters, and anti-Zionists. So it makes you begin to think that so-called even scientific research and scientific principles may be viewed in very different, indeed very contrary ways. Not surprising, but most certainly true in this case. And the British decision was political, Solomonic, let's divide it. And which becomes very important, the division was into how many parts? How many parts was, well, if you, Gallia divida est in tres partes. right? That we all know. Gaul was divided into three parts. Well, so was the Holy Land. There was an Arab part, a Jewish part, and an international condominium, which really meant a Christian part. All right. The Arab supporters romanticized present and the immediate past, and they argued that the reason there are so few people in Palestine is because of climate. Well, the real figures are fascinating. There are 700,000 people from the river to the sea of every religious persuasion at the time of the end of the First World War. There are 14 million people there today with prospects of the country growing even more. And when you realize that the country at that time had no electricity, there was no real road between what is Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. During the winter, you had to take a boat because the road was so muddy. The major exports were some agricultural products, and so on and so forth. This is a place of significant poverty and very few people. Mark Twain's sketch, The Woodcutting, is fairly accurate. Much of the country was underinhabited, underpopulated. This is going to be hard to see. The crucial figures are, in the ancient periods, there were more people in Palestine in the ancient world than there were for centuries afterwards, certainly after the, I'm going to take a drink. This is clear liquid. I think it's only water, though. What's really fascinating is that there were centuries from 1200 to 1900 when there were under 200,000 people in all of Palestine. This is it's not a land without people, but very few people. So the Zionist imagination and those Christian restorationists who came in the 19th century and said, we can restore the ancient magnificence of this country into a land of milk and honey, had something on which they could base their imagination. All right, you can't take in all the figures. The important thing is how few people actually live there. Well, history becomes the great argument. Indigeneity, that who's living there and how long have they been living there? Who is indigenous in the Middle East? Indeed, we know who's indigenous in Indiana, but who was indigenous in Europe? Who was indigenous in much of Africa? Who was indigenous in the Middle East, for which there is a huge record, archaeological, written, and the like. The need to be indigenous forced people to invent stories about themselves. Thus, in the 1920s, the Lebanese Maronites, who want to have a country, they become Phoenicians. The Copts claim, this is amazing because they claim to exist before Islam. They reference culture before the start of their own religion. They claim to be a pharaonic people. The example I know best is because I visited Ankara when it was safe for an Israeli to visit Ankara. And you go to the National Museum, the first big rooms are full of Hittite archaeological finds. Who were the Hittites? Sarah was a Hittite. From whom did Abraham buy his caves? From Hittites. Hittites were very important in that part of the world. And so this is not Erdogan's Turkey. This is the Turkey of the Young Turks, the Turkish of Kemal Ataturk, is that they felt the need to establish roots as they established a non-Islamic modern Turkey and they become Hittites. Young Jews also thought they were Canaanites. Special story, no time for it here. Hashemites. The Hashemite, where do they come from? They come from Southern Arabia. It should actually be Hashemite Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, but they lost the war against the Saudis. And the British gave them Transjordan. So after the 67 war, after Nasser falls and Pan-Arabism is no longer in favor, they decide that they have to find local roots, and they choose the Nabateans. And if you take a look at the dinar, the Jordanian dinar, you'll find under one arm Petra, and under the other arm, the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, is that the traditional role of the Hashemites is to protect religious sites. The Palestinians imagine themselves as the Jebusites. Now, in my prayers, I mentioned the Jebusites at least 3 times. Each time I have a prayer. Hayevusim, Achitim, Hayevusim, and so on and so forth. It is we who've kept the memory of the Jebusites alive, rather than anything in Palestinian literature. But this invention goes on, and with greater validity, but still tenuous, there is a new branch of modern Christianity called Palestinian liberation theology, and they reference Peter 1, chapter 2, verse 5, that they are the living stones, that they are really descendants of the original Christians who lived in the land. Well, let's talk about them just for a minute. Naim Atik comes from, I'm going to mention him a bit later as well. Naim Atik comes from Beit Sha'an, and that he is a direct, how does he know he's a direct descendant? Because his name is Atik. Atik in Arabic is the same as Atik in Hebrew, and it means ancient, right? All of you, of course, are faithful to the names that you carry with you, and so on. Another word, I think I'm running behind my time, so I better move on. There is a large invention of self going on among all peoples of the area, and it's not only in the Middle East. It's advantageous to be first and continuous. Mitri Rahib, a Lutheran from Bethlehem, invented the word theopolitics of settler colonialism. What that does is detach Jews from the Holy Land. It means they are the outsiders. And therefore, he, as a believing Christian, finds the most convenient, useful, germane, pertinent, secular theory to describe Zionists are as colonial settlers, are as outsiders. Any kind of real connection over time that they have is dismissed as artificial and illegitimate. The Zionists claim, I've done that before, so I won't do it now. The PLO does the same thing. This is their charter. They are the indigenous people of the region. There's only one charter that doesn't do it. Guess which one? The Hamas. The Hamas don't need to do it because God speaks to them directly. They don't need secular language. They don't need secular justifications. They have all the knowledge that they need that come from the Quran and their religious sources. It is a movement born and formed by articulating and carried forth a solely, entirely religious message. They've tried to incorporate recently secular language, but read the Charter of 1988. It is a thoroughly religious document. It begins with verses before each principle in the 38 chapters, paragraphs of it, and concludes with a religious principle from the Holy Text. All right, Judaism. Let's talk about some of the religions. Where is Judaism? What is the religious discourse of Judaism? Coming to my main points. Judaism has disagreements. What are the boundaries? What are the boundaries according to Judaism? You can question them. Is it from Dan to Beersheba? How far close to the Euphrates does it go? Does it go to El Arish? Not clear. What's really important is when and how the God's covenant is fulfilled. And I'll relate to you the most fascinating and pertinent exposition of the dispute based in Judaism of that issue. One position was taken by Hanan Porat, who was the leader of Gush Emunim. This was at a conference at Van Leer, right near the president's house in Jerusalem. And Hanan got up and said, look, I believe in the Messiah. Good point. Jews say that several times a day, actually. And I believe that when the Messiah comes, that this country is going to be ruled by religious law. And he sat down, and then up came Avi Ravitsky, who was the brilliant chair of Jewish philosophy. And he began by saying, listen, Hanan, you and I sat together in the yeshiva of Rav Kook in another part of the city. And we were friends then, and I trust we'll be friends now. But I agree with you, the Messiah is going to come. But I don't know when, and I don't know by whose agency the Messiah will come. Which really meant that you may wish to invoke that belief in order to justify settlements in the West Bank and the settlers movement, and you're the leader of Gush Emunim. I, on the other hand, are going to found Meimad, who will become a branch of the Labor Party, and argue for a pragmatic approach to the world in which we live, because when the end time comes, the end time will come, and things will be resolved by somebody other than ourselves. So you can read the same texts, but have diametrically different views. What else? Oh, Haredi, you wait for the Messiah. Religious Zionism. Reform changed. It used to be anti-Zionist until the 1930s, when it becomes Zionist, through Abba Hillel Silver and a whole host of other important leaders. Brit Shalom had an interesting gloss. It argued that, of course, we may live in this land. We're connected. We say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So we take the bread from the earth, and it's this earth. But the difference is that we can only do so ethically. And to do so ethically means that we have to arrange political institutions that are ethical. So you can have a variety of views by people who read the same texts and allegedly can pray together and count one another as part of the same minyan or religious group. What about Christianity? And I'll be happy for any kind of intervention and correction. The key issue is, does God still speak to the Jews with the appearance of Jesus? Did the coming of Jesus abrogate the covenants, or do they remain in force? Do the Jews still have a role in history? And if so, what is it? Do they still have a connection to the promised land, and what may it be? Those are the crucial questions. What, depending upon your response to these questions, will form your political opinion, your political viewpoint of how to deal with the conflict. And so Christianity, and this is my point regarding, as you will see, also Islam, there is no such thing as a Jewish view. There is no such thing as a Christian view, nor is there such thing as a Muslim point of view, believe it or not. There are multiple views in all of these traditions. And what's fascinating is that over the last century, is that with the real possibility that Jews might return and reclaim, reconstitute themselves, that these questions are not theoretical or moot, but they're actual. And by becoming actual, they invite and engender varieties of opinions and movements that are very often contrary to one another within their own theological tradition. St. Augustine is where the trouble begins. Supersessionism, which is, again, as I suggest, is colonial settlerism. And Herzl actually, he's such a smart man. But he went to the Pope asking for the Pope's permission and support for Zionism. And the Pope gave him the answer, "You're asking us? You're asking me? We could never sanction it. The Jews have not recognized our Lord. We therefore cannot recognize the Jewish people." They finished their role in history. Read St. Augustine if you don't believe me. Now, what's fascinating about even the Catholics is that they change. That's my point. Religions in the 20th century are dynamic. That by the end of the century, a successor pope is going to stand in Yad Vashem before the eternal light, ask for contrition, and a few years before that, 1993, will actually recognize a Jewish state. Now, he will not recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The language is very careful, but he will recognize that there is a state with a lot of Jews in it, that this deserves some measure of understanding. There's also pragmatics here. There's a lot of church property involved. In between, look in the middle, Pope Paul VI comes for an 11-hour visit in 1964. And he never says the word Israel. He means Shazar, if I'm not mistaken. And he thanks the authorities. Now, Shazar comes as he's supposed to, and brings bread and salt to give honor to the visitor. But the Pope will not grant recognition to the president of the state of Israel. It begins to change after Nostra Aetate. Indeed, the whole issue of the Roman Catholic Church and the recognition of Israel is fascinating. They oppose a Jewish state. They side with the Arabs until the fall of 1947, when the issue of partition comes up, and they change their mind only when the Soviets and the Americans argue that state that they are going to be in favor of the partition of Palestine. When they see that, they say it's a done deal. Opposition is not going to do us any good. Let's be pragmatic. And so let's go divide est in tres partes. And so that the best we can get is a three-part partition, Jewish, Arab, and international, which hopefully will be under Christian control. So again, theology, however it's stated, also has relationship to the practical. That's one example. Malik, a Lebanese Christian who were played, expressed the disappointment of many Christians after 1948, when the Jordanians claim half of Jerusalem and the Jews claim the other half. You know, there's an interesting struggle going on in Latin America today. The most active, surging religion is Pentecostalism. And it is in effect challenging the Roman Catholic Church. And in terms of, you can mark this in terms of the relationship of different countries towards Israel. Pentecostals tend to be favorable. The Roman Catholic Church still has reservations. These evangelicals, you know, you only have to look at one document. That document is the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The inaugural and the final benediction at the ceremony were given by evangelical pastors. No rabbi, not really. There's a kind of a cameo for a rabbi. No priests. And this is really an evangelical event. Well, the single largest pro-Israel group in America, alas, is not Philos. The largest group is CUFI, Christians United for Israel. And they give more money than many federations. And they do a lot of good works, not only in Israel, but in other places in the world. They see that as an important part of their religious mission. And that, again, this is a case where religion influences public policy. And the Trump administration will have Huckabee as their ambassador to Israel. No comment. All right. Who in the Christian world supported Israel? The most important groups were the main, believe it or not, the mainline Methodists, Episcopalians, and the like. They provided the support. The key figure was initially a British theologian, James Parks, and much as with much else over the last couple of centuries, at least since the 17th century, English Protestantism influenced American Protestantism. I've seen the James Parks papers, his correspondence with Joshua Heschel, and a whole host of rabbis and Jewish leaders. It's just amazing. And he came to the conclusion in the 1920s that God doesn't have to have one covenant. He can have multiple covenants. So what's all the fuss about? And if God has multiple covenants, that can also be a covenant with Jews, hence the notion of a double covenant and a rejection of supersessionism. And therefore, he becomes the leading Christian in England in support of a Jewish state. The Council of Christians and Jews established during the Second World War. The great scourge was Nazism, and was to marshal support among the British people against Nazism and in favor of a Jewish state. I see Judaism and Christianity as equals. That's a revolutionary idea. What Christian in the centuries beforehand would have said that? Here's the real hero. If you were coming to college to Indiana 70 years ago, you would have read in any number of courses Reinhold Niebuhr. Not read today. In fact, in some ways, he's been forcibly taken out of the curriculum. This is the cover of the 25th anniversary of Time magazine in 1948. Why is he there? Two reasons. He's the leading Protestant public theologian. You will find presidents up through Obama claiming that Niebuhr has made an important contribution to their own lives and their own theology. He does not deal with supersessionism. He rather comes to pro-Zionism of a very different root, and the root is the most traditional of possible Christian roots, and it is original sin. We are sinners, and if we examine the history of Christianity, among the sins that we have, for which we are responsible, is the sin of anti-Semitism. And so he becomes an advocate of a Jewish state. However, at the same time, he is one of the top leaders of the ADA, the American Democratic Action. His colleagues are Eleanor Roosevelt, Hubert Humphrey. It's the leadership of the Democratic Party on reform to make society more just. Small anecdote, and there's some people who know about the Hebrew University. The only person who I think the Hebrew University ever gave an honorary doctorate to outside the borders of the state of Israel was Reinhold Niebuhr. I found in the Niebuhr papers in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he went to retire, the text of his acceptance speech. Rotstreich was there, Mazar, the president, the rector, the ambassador to Great Britain, the ambassador to Washington, all showed up to give this man an honorary doctorate. And it's fascinating. And what he writes on his little acceptance notes, I am a Hebrew. So deep was his identification with Zionism and the need for Zionism. Know, however, that in his Zionism, he also appreciated that injustice might be done to Arabs. And he, like Parks, argued that Jews ought to be sensitive, to treat the refugees better than they are, accept some of them back, because that would be the moral and the right thing to do. But in a world which, and this is why he was read at the time, in a world where man is immoral, where things are not perfect. We can imagine utopia, but we really don't know how to get there. In that kind of world, we have to do the best that we possibly can with the best imagination, the best tools, the most insistent, clever ways we can muster. In that world, Jews need a state more than the Arabs of Palestine need a state, but that doesn't mean excluding or diminishing them. An interesting view, and a view that may still be valid. Anyway, that's what's interesting, by the way, if you read the Presbyterian Study Guide today, 8 of the first 10 chapters are devoted to colonial settlerism and the illegitimacy of Jews. The last 2 are devoted to why Reinhold Niebuhr deserves to be driven out of the church. Because in his world of good and evil, he was a Cold Warrior. He thought the Soviet Union was evil, communism was bad, and so on and so forth. All right, let me see. Why did Truman accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state? Because his partner was Eddie Jacobson and a haberdashery business in Kansas City. Because of the people who ran Hadassah around Central Park, and we can go on. Or why did he counter the Pentagon and the State Department who argued against recognizing Israel? I can just tell you the best scholarship I know doesn't tell us. The argument is real and vital and angry. But I can tell you is that after the fact, he gave his signature to this book, which is titled, I Am Cyrus. So who knows on what level he argued in real time. But it's interesting that retrospectively, he could invoke the Bible to interpret his own actions. Whoops. There we go. Islam, finally. Islam is a story that you all know, right? You've looked at the Quran. Jews are perfidious, they're traitors. They stood up against their own prophets. They deserve punishment. They deserve exile. The world is divided into 2 abodes, the abode of Islam and the abode of the non-believers, and which is an abode of war. We have to be in constant conflict with them. They actually run the place. Not only that, if you read the Quran, you'll find the Jews are referred to as apes and pigs, animals, not really human beings. If you wish to cull the Quran for anti-Semitism, you can do so. If you want to look for other verses that are favorable to Jews, you can also find them. For that matter, all these great texts have more than one set of values. That's what makes them great texts. They have multiple meanings and multiple possibilities. But it is they who have the problem. They've been running this place for 13 centuries. So what do they do after 1917 or 1922 when there's a British mandate? Do they adjust? Do they accept this or not? You know the answer. Who's the leader of the Palestinian Arabs? He is the religious leader of the Arabs in Palestine. He's the Mufti, which is a religious office, non-elected, appointed by the British in their great wisdom. So how do you explain what I've just said, in which you know that Sadat comes to Jerusalem and says no more war? What kind of a Muslim is he? Well, Sadat was a believing Muslim and a practicing Muslim. So what is his justification? How does he manage to do something so anti-religious, anti-traditional as making peace with the Jews who now run as a sovereign state, a piece of the abode of Islam? Good question. If you want to find the answer, you have to look for it in a religious document. The only possibility of justifying this is religiously. This is a part of a longer document written by the chief imam, the chief rabbi of Cairo. Read it to yourselves. I guess some people are watching it at home. It essentially says that Islam is a religion of peace, security, that if people turn to us in peace, we can respond in peace. What he's not writing in here is some additional paragraphs. If they give the Sinai back, we'll consider making peace with them. If they behave appropriately with the Palestinians, we can make peace with them. So there's pragmatism, but there's also a religious principle. But that's my point. Judaism has a variety of principles. Christianity has a variety of theological principles, and so does Islam. Islam is not to be painted with one brush, and woe unto those who are dependent upon good and who wish for good relations with Muslims to imagine them as being unidimensional and fixed in time, incapable of change, even as everybody else is capable of change. Take a look at the Islamic Charter. Here it is, obliterate Israel. Muslims may kill Jews, find Jews and kill them. There's no solution for the Palestinian problem except by jihad, and so on. Moreover, Hudna is a temporary armistice. Hudna in Islamic tradition is merely temporary, and war may be resumed at the discretion of Hamas, as it did on October 7th. The peace with the Jewish state is not a theological possibility, and so on. There are other pieces that I mentioned the Jews in the Quran. The language, the popular language in the street includes, I don't know what you know and what you don't know, Khaybar. If you watched, like I do, I don't, if Egyptian television during this past month, the month of Ramadan, you would find programs on Khaybar, which was an event in 638 when the Prophet destroyed a Jewish community in Southern Arabia because he considered them to be perfidious, and that was justified by his religion. And it is a program that depicts Jews every year, depicts Jews as perfidious and as they're described negatively in the Quran. Jews, the use of the notion of Jews, Zionists as contemporary crusaders. There's a unit of every Arab army that calls themselves Saladin. Why Saladin? Because he expelled the crusaders at Tritin in 1187. Arafat considered, when he came to, Amos Oz wrote a very interesting essay on the entry of Arafat in 2000 into Gaza, and it is the people applauding Arafat as the contemporary Saladin. The major argument that comes before the United Nations issue is the issue of Jerusalem. Do Jews have any relationship to the Temple Mount? And recent judgments of the United Nations by the mobilized majority of the UN will ignore the Jewish relationship to it. It's part of the large campaign of lawfare that's against which the Jewish state must endure. So there's a lot going on which is not that distinct from the Hamas Charter, except the Hamas Charter is so explicit in the use of force and violence to actualize its theological positions. Well, is there another side to it? And the answer is yes. The Abraham Accords of 2020, one of the great tragedies of the present, and I hope it is not a permanent tragedy, the Hamas were concerned that Saudi Arabia would the Abraham Accords. And it's claimed, I'm not a political scientist or a strategist, that much of what they try to do was to upset that possibility. What I find significant is the statement by Mansour Abbas. He was the first Arab to enter into an Israeli cabinet as a minister. And he does so as a proud Muslim and a member of the Islamic movement, the head of the Northern Branch, which is the most active part of the Islamic movement in Israel. And he does so for the mutual benefit of the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews. That is not Netanyahu's government. That is the government prior to Netanyahu's government, the Bennett government. So things were becoming possible until October 7th. You're pointing to your watch, and I will therefore prove that I can. Contemporary expressions, I'm going to skip that. You know all about that. It's where we are at the present. And I find it a very troubling time. And I know that I should be more neutral and circumspect than I should be in an academic setting. But hang it all, it's my country, I care about it. And there are things that are going on there that, in the context of the presentation here, I find deeply disturbing. And this is the statement of the current government. The Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, the Galilee, the Negev, and the Golan, and Judea and Samaria. That is not a rational secular statement. That is a statement that comes out of the balance of forces in the contemporary government. What I find so troubling is that the bitter historic irony is that after so successfully doing something that on appearance was impossible, is that Jews would achieve legitimacy and recognition in the world community on the basis of what we saw at the beginning, on the basis of largely, apparently secular arguments, are now returning to themselves to employ religious justifications in explaining their political objectives. That is not a winning situation. I cannot imagine Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, or maybe even the prime minister being successful as were Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky, and Weizmann, whose language was so very different and so very appropriate a century ago and over the many decades thereafter. And so why, in heaven's name, does that language have to be shifted at present rather than dealing with the territory in which we have contended our legitimacy and giving it up for the sake of this, I hope will not become the historic tragedy and tragedy. This is my last slide, and it is the fundamental one. You know what the first argument to the Zionist Congress in Basel was? It's over one word. It was over the first word of the Zionist platform, and it was whether or not öffentlich or openly, that becomes publicly in the English translation, would be used in the Zionist program. What we hope to achieve, will we do this openly, or will we accomplish this as we have protected Jewish rights over the many centuries, through the Hofjuden, through the Stadlan, through the intercessor, the person with influence? How are we going to manage this impossible revolutionary task of creating an independent Jewish state in our ancient land. There was a minority that argued for keeping out publicly and by continuing with the method that worked more or less at different times. The vast majority demanded that they do it publicly. In the year 2025, there is no other way than to do it publicly. We live in the public square in this university, in the streets of Paris and London and New York. We read the newspapers, we read the journals, we see it on television. The issue of to whom this land belongs is a very public issue, and the stakes and the interests are very deep, very keenly felt, very diverse. And how to achieve or re-achieve legitimacy is really the challenge of the present, when perhaps it need not have been, or at least need not have been, with the same kind of intensity that we're experiencing it today. And with that, I will stop.